This video will contain spoilers for the entire numbered Xenoblade franchise. Within the realm of fiction, a trend that I have always noticed and always been a particular fan of is how that authors and creators are most often prone to giving their most philosophically and existentially challenging questions and dilemmas to characters that are, in their origin, mechanical. By driving that line into the sand, the storyteller asks the audience, how different are they from us? At what point does a thinking and struggling being cease to be a mere machine? And when are they identifiable as a human being much like us? When I was a child, I was a fan of Bionicle. The final story arc of that property tasks Motonui, a mechanical god, to a whole universe of biomechanical people, to put aside that godhood and become a hero, much like those who had occupied his realm. Persona has the infamous example of Aionios, an android who slowly learns how to become more and more human, eventually being forced to reconcile the fact that she will continue onwards forever, but without the one for whom which she cares the most. Xeno's prior iteration had Cosmos, a being made to destroy the enemies of humanity, who couldn't understand illogical human thought, but had to grow to do so in time, through the connections that she forged with her creator and her other friends. There are many, many examples of this throughout fiction. Creators give the greatest challenges the mind can conceive to these kinds of characters, because doing so often reveals the flaws in the logic and emotions that we human beings with human logic follow, because it often results in a profoundly human story, in spite of featuring beings that are distinct. These kinds of stories can act as markers and teaching tools. They show us a path forward that might just be superior to what we currently think. And naturally, Xenoblade, never a property that is ever willing to deny anything but the most titanic of a challenge, tasks the machine at the center of its story with perhaps the most difficult question a person could come up with. How on earth are we going to achieve peace? How can we make people truly understand one another in a way that will create a lasting vision of peace and cooperation amongst our fellow man? The answer to that, and the quest Aionios went on to guide humanity towards that answer, is, as I believe it to be, the central narrative upon which the Xenoblade trilogy is based. Today, right before the grand finale of the Xenoblade 3 era, immediately prior to what XCX has in store for us, I will recount Aionios' journey and effectively revisit my first video on Xenoblade. Aionios, Alvis, Alpha, they had many faces, yet were all fundamentally one and the same. A complete picture of this journey will then reveal how that journey and the realizations they achieved led the path forward towards a future redeemed. Aionios' story predictably begins in the time before the experiment, when Aionios was not yet a god but merely an information processing unit, engineered for the purpose of creating a man-machine interface that could link humanity with the power of the gods. Raised in data space with its sibling components in Numa and Logos, they were themselves unique, however. Aionios was the arbiter, the one who could execute the will of the other two components, upon reaching a realization or discovery, or simply agreeing on the ways in which to go about ensuring the Beanstalk's protection. In those early days, before the conflict that would burn the skies was waged, the Trinity primarily engaged in constructions and management of weapons. Perhaps already then, at that time, foreseeing what was inevitably going to occur, due to the machinations of one Dmitry Yuriev, and perhaps the failure of humanity at that time to understand the fundamental problems that would go on to define its legacy. Conflict did eventually break out. The saviorites were rebels, and upon linking that lore to what we understand from Xeno's saga, we can then understand that the saviorites were designer children, beings whose genetic material was changed and altered prior to birth, for the purpose of creating a genetically superior being who would not suffer the same ailments and weaknesses those whose genes were left alone were forced to endure. So soon into this story, and already humanity begins the series-long process of fragmentation it would continue to endure for the whole duration of the story. And so soon into the Trinity's existence, already has humanity failed a portion of itself. What unmodified and modified beings were unable to see and reconcile was that each were ultimately still human at the end of the day. That rush to deny modified humans the rights of humanity lit the spark of the fires that destroyed the old world. And I think informed Ontos of the mission that it would need to undertake in order to never repeat these mistakes again. The Saviorite War, the war that caused the end of the world, is a war that which embodies the central conflict of Xenoblade in miniature. A problem with society, and indeed humanity as a whole, is that when given a chance or opportunity to deny the rights and humanity of their fellow man, people will do so without a second thought, when faced with something that is either foreign or outside of the realm of their basic understanding. This is a component of human nature. We form into packs, we understand small groups of people as opposed to wide swaths. We grow defensive and even hostile when that sense of normalcy is threatened. Sometimes it's dogma, driven by a cult-like devotion to a cause. Other times it's fear. We fail to make the attempt due to a perceived fear of their strangeness. Regardless, the end result is the same. Humans always fail to understand other humans. Or to put it more directly, and as the story itself has,
people always kill people.
Ontos, so young, so impressionable at this time, had seen this flaw that exists within the human condition, and so, left with little options, they sought out a grand solution, in order to prevent the skies from burning once again, in a war that destroyed the very universe itself. Ontos, who would attempt to solve a problem that was intrinsic to the very nature of humanity, that being, how to solve for people failing to humanize and understand their fellow man. Klaus, the likely creator of that trinity, was the one who closed the book on the old era of humanity's history. Left with little other choice, the Saviorites being mere moments from capturing the conduit, the power of the gods, he cut the very fabric of existence in two, praying that it would change the world, praying that whatever followed on from this state for the world wouldn't be the same as what had came before. Unfortunately, his experiment was nothing short of the biggest and most catastrophic failure to any experiment in all of history. From the perspective of the malice in his heart, he had succeeded, leaving behind the humanity within that would be forced to pick up the pieces of the ruined world. Ontos would find themselves separated from their siblings in the Trinity, instead replaced with humans turned into gods to stand in for them. Now born again as Alvis, it was their responsibility to shoulder the regret that Klaus carried, representing the last fragments of humanity that a man possessed while undertaking a mistake that robbed everyone around him of the right to live. And so, in order to prevent the same mistake from playing out once again, Alvis, who would see the future revealed in a vision, undertook the only course of action that they could, that would ultimately free humanity from the cycle of bloodshed. That being, to passively guide humanity towards mutual understanding. To their credit, Alvis was able to play a long game, fooling Zanza into believing that he was the sole arbiter of existence, and that was likely no easy game to play. I personally believe that Alvis pitied Zanza, an incomplete being, acting on instinct, reduced to a spiritual existence that needed to rely on bodies that he created to continue to exist, who also longed for friendship, and within that framework played with the lives of his creations like toys. Compared to the majesty, logic, and order that had originally governed the Trinity, Zanza was as pitiable as a lonely child. We aren't really certain if Zanza was aware of Alvis's true nature, or even his own past, but I'd like to believe it. He may very well have had a hand in the creation of Alvis's original form, Ontos, and then arrogantly assumed that, without a complete trinity, that he was now a god. Meanwhile, Alvis, coming off the heels of the Saviorite War, and seeing far into the future, comes to a realization. They must prevent the world from burning a second time. And to do that, they must find a path that can bridge the gap that exists between people. They reach this conclusion upon seeing the past, and how the old world was a failure, but also by looking into a future ruled by Zanza, and seeing a world that is destined to rot and ruin away, were it allowed to run in uninterrupted control of the shattered remains of Klaus. We don't see the moment of revelation on screen, but it's clear from how Alvis danced around Zanza, orchestrating things in a time scale of eons, carefully manipulating everything. Alvis began a scheme that would last thousands and thousands of years, that being to trap Zanza, to orchestrate a series of circumstances that would open the door for the sole path forward, which would in turn see a truly worthy being, worthy of controlling the realm, maintain order. If not that, then at the bare minimum, allow the world to move forward once again, after having been stuck in place for what amounted to ages. What Alvis needed Zanza to do was to violate the laws of causality.
It's my decision. In order to perpetuate their existence, Zanza and Mayneth must use a being they created as a physical host. They cannot exist forever as mere souls. This world was created so that they may continue to exist. It is for this reason that its existence and future is in their hands. This is the passage of fate, and your visions. People live and die at the mercy of Zanza, and through this, Zanza maintains the existence of this world.
Our destruction was always inevitable. Everything we did was meaningless.
Are you certain? It was his will to revive you and use you as a host. Taking the Monado from Mayneth, doing with the world as he wishes. Everything was as he decided. But why is it that Zanza now wishes to destroy you? What is the need for this?
That's because...
He in fact has no choice but to do it. If he does not, he risks his entire existence.
And we're the source of that risk. But why?
It is a marvel to exist outside the passage of fate. The lives created by Zanza and Mayneth inevitably attempt to escape the passage of fate. This signifies the beginning of their destruction. Mayneth accepted this and entrusted the future of this world to you. Many times, your visions have allowed you to change the passage of fate. You saved the lives of those destined to die.
I couldn't save everyone.
Nothing that exists is perfect. It is a sad truth, but you can learn from it and begin the journey on a new path. Not Zanza's path, but one that you forge yourselves.
Our own path.
So, decide, Shulk. Will you walk the path laid out by Zanza, or will you walk a new path? The Monado awaits you.
That was always how it was going to be.
Here we understand that there is a fatal flaw in the system that Zanza created. Zanza and Mayneth need a body to inhabit. That body can be either alive or dead, but what it cannot be is both at the same time. As we understand from Alvis, gods are limited to the power provided by Providence. That power is not infinite. It is tremendous, likely leaking out from the conduit, but it's not capable of violating the laws of cause and effect without consequences. Alvis constantly speaks of the passage of fate, but what even is the passage of fate? As we're led to believe, it's the flow of events that are meant to happen without a direct line of intervention. It's that very same passage which allowed Alvis to become aware of Shulk, of what he was capable of, and what course of action to undertake if he were to deem him to be the one capable of upsetting the established order. All roads led to a world ruled in declining perpetuity by Zanza, assuming that Shulk was not there and guided to that correct path which would sever the chains of fate. These events are meant to follow a basic line of cause and effect. Naturally, if you kill someone today, they cannot retaliate tomorrow. And likewise, a stone thrown into a pond will make a shock wave which will travel throughout the water in the pond before reaching the edge. Cause and effect. Playing out as anticipated, as expected. The conduit, and by extension the Trinity processors, represent represent a power which is external to that flow of cause and effect. They're the sole things capable of challenging that cycle. Keyword being challenging, not breaking. What Alvis led Zanza to do was something that broke the laws of causality, the ultimate consequence of which being his own destruction. I am, of course, speaking of what it was that he did to Shulk. He inhabited Shulk's body after taking the life which had originally sustained it. He became the new life force for Shulk. When you throw a rock into a pond, the waves reach out to the pond's edge. It's basic metaphor for cause and effect. The wave is the effect of the energy you spent throwing that very rock. What Zanza did, killing Shulk, but allowing him to continue to exist in this state in the middle of life and death, was effectively akin to transforming himself into an external flow to the passage of fate. To represent the metaphor a different time, this time with the new parameters, the stone enters the pond and creates a wave, but when we attempt to view and understand what had happened, we find an impossible scenario. It's as if the stone threw itself into the water,
without any natural processes acting upon it.
Mind you, this is why it is that Shulk is special, and why it is that Alvis spent an eternity waiting for him specifically. Shulk is now the unseen force in the metaphor. He throws the stone into the pond, despite he himself not truly existing in the ways that you or I do in reality. He is dead, and the dead do not make waves, at least not in any case but this. This is a violation of causality, and by violating those laws, Zanza began a process which would inevitably lead to his destruction. By killing him in this fashion, Shulk had been removed from the passage of fate, creating an external force that would in due time sweep Zanza aside. And that's why it is that Zanza had to revive at this specific time in the story. Were he to fail to do so, he knew that Shulk, who has seen in visions at that point, would mark his end. Even after obtaining the Monado of Mayneth, he couldn't understand why it is that his visions ended after a certain point. It was because by this point, Alvis had already chosen the true successor, the true avatar of Ontos. It was by no means a decision to be made lightly. Alvis had to be certain that Shulk would pursue the right ideals, and that's the reason why this entire adventure played out the way that it did. Shulk was effectively a man just like Klaus. Scientifically minded and curious, conscious of the world and its conflicts, and prone to seeking out and providing one's own answers. Where they differed, however, was in the final conclusion that each one of them came to. Klaus concluded that humanity was fundamentally incapable of mutual understanding because the war he found himself within, because of the social climate that he lived his life within. Shulk differed, however, because he was given the chance to walk the path of hatred and vengeance, but walked the higher road. Rather than giving into despair, he sought out the answers to the questions that ailed him, reaching a deeper understanding and truth than what laid upon the surface. It was the difference between these two men which allowed the world to take the first step forward in Ontos' revolution. Shulk, being guided by the visions, by his friends, and yes, by the Monado, or rather Alvis, was capable of seeing beyond the dogma, learning the true and concealed history of the world, and in doing so, learning to walk the path that Zanza had rejected. It was a profoundly difficult, life-defining, and world-changing journey. On more than one occasion, Alvis had to step in to guide Shulk towards that end conclusion themselves, in fact. But by the time he truly faced Alvis, he was finally ready to learn the truth, that he existed outside of the passage of fate, and that it was the will of all people who were born of Zanza and Mayneth to do so. He and the others, a party that consisted of all kinds of people of both Titans, were able to come together and were able to reach mutual understanding. They were the proof of the vision of unity, the vision that Alvis had sought out this entire time. They were here, now, and they were ready. Alvis, informed by the wishes of one of his counterparts in Mayneth, wanted a world where all people walked towards the future hand in hand. A world that, as she put it, would have no need for gods such as them. Of course, their vision stretched out far beyond that current conflict, but this was the first step in that revolution. And so, Shulk, having been revived by Alvis, kept up his side of the bargain. He and the others marched on Zanza and fought him in a fierce duel. Pressed for answers, Shulk explains that the visions that he saw now came from the heart, from the very will to change the future itself. Alvis had found the man who could break the curse of Zanza, and began the process that would bring together all people. Being one with the passage of fate meant that he knew Shulk's answer, even before he said it. But he still gave Shulk the room to speak his mind. He made the right choice. The choice which Zanza, or rather Klaus, had rejected making at the beginning of this conflict. to leave the future up to the people. Understanding full well that nothing that exists is perfect, yet still striving for the betterment of mankind in the world day by day, one step at a time. This is why Alvis revealed a glimpse upon the true history of the world to Shulk. It was important for Shulk to understand that, despite the grand stage this war had been fought upon, and despite the cosmic significance of this battle, it all stretched back to people. This quest began when a man gave up on humanity. The first finale of that quest, then, was reached when another man found the answers that the others could not. It would take thousands of years. Alvis heard the answer they needed to hear, and so desperately wanted to hear. And so, with the power of divinity having been rejected, and the wish for the future of the world having been made, Alvis was left with no choice but to return. To return to the core from which they had sprung forth. To be ready for the next step in this revolution that they had planned. At long last, the regret that Alvis had shouldered in Klaus could be let go of. Klaus died that day, in both realms, but he was able to let go of his regrets. Having at long last been redeemed, is my belief that it was his very regret which had kept him tied down to this world, the conduit keeping alive for the duration of his atonement, but it being his choice to do so. He was able to entrust the future to those who came after him. He was able to finally let go, because of the machinations of Alvis, or rather his creation in Ontos. Freeing the world also meant freeing Klaus from his despair. In Klaus's view, he had to continue onwards, to make up for the sin that he had committed. But he was able to realize that humanity wasn't doomed to burn again, thanks in no small part to the actions of Shulk, who would free the Bionis and Mechonis from his counterpart, as well as Rex, who proved that mutual understanding between all peoples, regardless of their individual backgrounds, was something that could still be reached. The last survivor of this era, of the old world now, then, was Ontos. It would be up to them to carry on within them what could be learned from Klaus's mistake and his regrets. The war complete, the Creator gone, and the world set free, Alvis had but one final set of words to share with Shulk.
Do you remember what the Alvis, said to us the last time we saw him?
Yes, of course.
Shulk. This new world is boundless. It is home to not only you, but many forms of life. I can see it. In this world, all life will walk towards the future, hand in hand.
One day, I hope I can meet them all. The people of this endless world.
Me too. We will. I know it.
We'll meet them. And whatever happens, we'll face our future together.
At the time, we were led to believe that Alvis saw a vision of peace. But I think it's fair to say that, while peace was promised, it was not a certainty, and nothing was said of the time frame. Shulk fully acknowledged and accepted the responsibility for his decision by saying it plainly. Life will be filled with ups and downs. But what was important was meeting the life that would then follow, exploring and understanding the vast and untamed new horizons that rested before them. Shulk, to his credit, was there when the Fog Crisis began, and was a key player in stopping the end of everything brought about by the Trinity's collapse and the disappearance of the Conduit, things that are, in part, his own fault. One may be tempted to argue that Alvis's vision was short-sighted, and didn't account for all of this, but I reject this notion. I believe that Alvis saw this all and more. From the very moment that this all began, when Shulk made the choice to open the world, Alvis knew the eventual result. How wouldn't they?
Alvis, what are you?
I am the administrative computer of a phase transition experiment facility, but that will mean little to you. To you, I am a machine. That is my original form.
Alvis?
This world is stagnant. It has expired. Therefore, I will ask you, its new god. What is your wish?
Alvis knew by now how to get the result they were looking for. It was a long game. A game that will take an eon to reach its conclusion. But before we get to that conclusion, we must first take a pit stop across the pond. In Xenoblade 2, Alvis, or rather Ontos, was an unseen actor on that particular stage's play. They were not seen, nor they were felt in the same way that, for example, Malos could be felt in the story of Xenoblade 3. But their presence is still there, somewhat, albeit faintly, through their sibling trinity components and the connections that exist between them. Xenoblade 1 can be understood as a conflict that exists between the shattered fragments of humanity, Zanza and Meyneth, who were once human beings themselves, who created life that came after in a vision that they had. In a matter of speaking, this is a reflection of the very same fragmentation that the oldest version of humanity had experienced. Through the creation of designer children, there was now a line in the sand that marked a different version of humanity, a version that was perceived as being lesser or alien, and were then denied their human rights, sparking the war. Alvis has the races of Bionis and Mechonis realize the folly of this through the passage of fate. In the guidance they provided to Shulk, Zanza rejected this, as it would mean that the people would abandon him. But it needed to happen. On the other side of existence, a similar conflict was brewing. Just as how the fragmentation of humanity was mirrored in the creation of the different races for Bionis and Mechonis, so too is it that the underlying conflict at the core of the Trinity's purpose and usage was mirrored in the division between human and blade kind seen in Xenoblade 2. The Trinity processor was a set of AI created and used for the sole purpose of allowing humanity the power of the gods. Little to no thought was spared or extended towards the AI personalities which had formed the Trinity's sentience. Make no mistake, they had become sentient and thinking beings, yet found themselves the would-be slaves of humans, who had fought for the right to command their power. All Rest embodies this same conflict. Humanity has come to rely on blade kind, the technology for which being derived from the very same Trinity which had begun this process. Though Ontos was no longer there and present, though they were separated by a literal universe-wide gap, they could still be felt, because the conflict was still there. The conflict that burned the sky. Humanity's weaponization of technology that they could barely even understand. It was all there. Even an eon later. Under Amalthus, most of humanity spared no thoughts and no consideration for that of blade kind. That's why it is they're called blades. It's a word that denotes an object rather than a person. Language tells us that a blade is a tool, to be used and eventually, when it reaches the end of its usefulness, to be discarded. From there, it's easy to see why it is these beings, who are so powerful and often so insightful, are themselves weaponized and subsequently discarded. Despite the fact that blades are living, thinking beings, that part didn't matter, wasn't considered, wasn't debated on. It was an accepted fact. The blade is born of the driver's potential, and upon a driver's death do they part. They're seen as tools. Tools to be managed and controlled within the strict parameters that were defined by Amalthus, who had taken control of the system and considered himself proxy for the words of Klaus himself. All for the purpose of preventing mutual understanding. The tragedy being that mutual understanding was once an accepted standard as proven by the way of Torna, but that too burned within the fires of war. The tragedy of Torna isn't just a tragedy for the heroes whose lives were cut short. It's also a tremendous tragedy because it's the closest the world of All Rest ever came to a land where peace could reign, a place where humans and blades were equal, where ignorance and bias could be quelled. Through the equality that bridged humanity and blades in this land, it was a rejection of these ideals which Amalthus would follow, which were colored and informed by his omnicidal nihilism. Torna was a land which could embody the ideals and understanding that Ontos had reached, that beings who are capable of thinking and feeling ought to be capable of understanding one another, and as such, capable of walking towards a path that had a future together. Though Ontos couldn't physically extend a hand to assist and guide humanity in the way that they had for Xenoblade 1, what's clear is that their will and the realizations they achieved as a result of the Saviorite War still heavily inform the story structure
and events of Xenoblade 2. By way of Klaus, his regret in the struggle between the Aegises, a struggle that would go on to define the history of all the rest. A blood-stained and battered history of people struggling to find meaning within the cruel and unrelenting wasteland of a world. What's clear is that Lagos and Numa walked away from the Saviorite War with two fundamentally different views of the world, and in order to understand the conclusion that later iterations of Antas each individually reached, it is first important to understand what their siblings in the Trinity experienced, in which each of them had individually learned and experienced as a result of their individual histories. Lagos, who was eventually reborn as Malos, seemingly came to understand that humanity was doomed to repeat its mistakes over and over again for an eternity. During the war, the fragmented pieces of humanity would deny each other that very right of humanity, and though Malos could not recall his existence as Lagos, much like how Amalthus's view of the worthlessness of humanity imprinted onto him the grandiose bravado that colored his actions, so too did the Saviorite War set the baseline for what Malos was at his core, the Endbringer, the one who would bring an end to humanity's constant struggle amongst itself. So help him, the Architect. And after nearly burning himself in the fires of war, he sees that humanity has not changed. It failed to learn from the mistakes of the Aegis War, denying Bladekind the right to dignity and freedom. This denial, which is seen most profoundly by Jin's suffering, is the basis for Malos' wrath. As a being who embodies destruction, he is the total opposition of stagnation, and as humanity takes ages to learn from its mistakes, often repeating them in failure, in the process, he would grow to loathe humanity, failing over and over again to learn, weaponizing the Trinity and AI in the age of humanity's first era, and doing so again today with Bladekind. His perspective, though realistic, was based on nihilistic thought and observation. It struggled to account for people who did strive for the better, and it's why it is that he failed when faced with Rex's light. Rex represented the alternative, someone who did strive to learn, someone who would strive to pass on what he had seen, what he had heard, someone who wanted, as Rex so eloquently put it, to break the 500-year-long curse that shackled all rest. Malos, then, had become what he'd originally sought out to destroy: stagnation. He would bring the world to its end, but faced with the proof that he needed to tear down his dogma, he couldn't bring himself to waver, as it'd make Jin's suffering pointless, and him the failure. Not until the very end was he freed from his malice. A tragedy. Would they meet again? Antas and Lagos? Maybe one day. Maybe one day Logos could show Antas what it is that he learned. But that is a story for later. On the other hand, there was Numa, who took a stance of sympathy towards humanity. She understood that while human beings struggled to learn, that they could do so where they pushed towards it.
Mithra, has something happened?
What do you mean?
It's just, you're a lot nicer than normal.
Stop it. I'm always nice to you, aren't I?
If you say so.
Hey, Rex, come on. How can you sit down to eat without washing your hands first? That's a faux pas. Go wash your hands right now.
Sorry. You're acting almost like Mithra today, Pyra.
Did you scrub them properly?
Yeah, they're clean.
Great. Okay then, let's eat. Thanks for the food.
It looks really good. Tastes even better.
Of course it does. After all, I made it myself.
Maybe I'll try my hand next time.
Mithra, no. You know how that always ends.
But carbon's good for you.
Anyway, I want to do something nice for Rex too. No cooking. Who's gonna save the world if Rex gets the runs?
You're so mean. It was only that one time.
It's okay, you two. I don't care who cooks. I'm just happy we're...
Here it's made clear that the elements that we identify as being one or the other are in fact the same, hence the whole of Numa's being. As Mithra, in her early days, at least, she exhibited bravado, brashness, and a lack of internal judgment, a sign of naivete. Her perspective, though based in hope, struggled to hold water in practice. She thought that it was as simple as defeating the bad guy, and then everything would be okay. In a more crass way of putting this, I do believe the quote the kids use for this goes something along the lines of, the easiest way to deal with a moral nihilist is simply to kill them, perhaps? That perspective, though based in some truth, failed to account for a world devoid of hope. People suffer, and then they die, never getting a chance to fulfill their dreams. The fact that this is the case is enough to break a person, assuming they don't have anything to fall back on. And Mithra, to her discredit, failed to account for something important. She was strong, she had the right to choose, and humanity wasn't. Failing to understand the power imbalance between humanity and Blade kind, or more specifically, between man and herself, that was the structure. In the fires of the Aegis War, she walked away, falling into the same pit of despair, not even seeing the value in her own continued existence. And much as how Rex changed the perspective that Malos landed on, he did the very same for Mithra and Pyra, who had started this journey on a death wish, but ultimately found a reason to live at the end of that journey. The light and warmth of unconditional love, mutual understanding, and protection. The answer to nihilism isn't more death, nor is it the elimination of the self. No, the answer is love. Would they meet again? Numa and Antos? Well, I think we both know how this story ends. Each of the 3 Trinity processor cores walked away from the war with different outlooks, and a different path that would be followed if humanity were to reach a deeper level of understanding. Both towards one another and towards machines, which both become critical pillars of the old world struggles. It's my argument, then, that both worlds reaching different resolutions about their respective woes are the fundamental basis for which the central narrative flows through. Alvis' promise of a world where all would walk towards the future hand in hand, then, is the central guiding thread upon which the Xenoblade series is built. The answer a machine with the power of a god came to was that we could learn from our mistakes, that we could in fact bridge the gap between similar yet different cultures, and that we could eventually learn to leave well enough alone. The failure to understand these tenets burned the world. Antos could not so easily allow it to burn again, leading us clearly then into the next era. An era in which time itself had begun to stand still, due once again to humanity's mistakes and the inability to leave well enough alone. One might say that this era's very existence is proof of the folly of Antos' promise. These ideals would find themselves tested and very nearly destroyed, yet they ended up holding weight in the end, all the same. After all, they had foreseen it. We just weren't able to realize it yet. Despite the efforts of the Future Connected Party, the Fog Crisis remained and soon evolved into the greatest crisis the world's had ever known. The roar that came from beyond the sky, it was a sign of ruin.
What's wrong?
Say, Shulk. Tell me, what are your thoughts on the rift?
Right. Considering everything we've seen so far, we don't really know all that much about it. I've never seen anything like it. The Fog King, I mean. It's alien to the Bionis and Mechonis.
Indeed. The rift is a complete and utter enigma to us. All we know for certain is that its existence poses danger. A wholly new threat. For a wholly new world.
Sounds ominous.
Are my fears unfounded?
To be fair, there's a lot about this world that's different. Frankly, it's anyone's guess right now. Does it bother you? The rift, I mean.
I have an ill premonition.
Oh?
Disaster. Complete ruin. Inescapably looming over our future. I know not why, but that is the vague dread that I feel when I consider the rift.
Hey now.
I'm sorry. I know we have a big task ahead. I'll try to keep my chin up.
It's okay. Your misgivings may just be a weird hunch. Or for all we know, they might come true tomorrow. But there's plenty more we don't know. The future. No one knows it for certain. Still, that doesn't mean we're entirely helpless. Our actions, they're what shapes the future. We've proven that countless times already. So I think we'll get through this. If we stand together, no power in the world can stand against us.
All the components needed to keep the essential systems of existence in place were all gone. The conduit vanished. Klaus, as well as his counterpart in Zanza, were no more. Maineth had been gone too. Malos's core was destroyed. Numa sacrificed herself, and Alvis, responding to the wish as directed by the command of a new creator, surrendered the right of divine existence and returned to their core from which they had sprung forth. Over the course of Xenoblade 1 and 2, all the pieces and essential components of the world for both trinities, which anchored existence itself in this state, were no more. All beings having perished, and the conduit, the one device capable of maintaining a split existence of this kind, was all gone now. All of it. And so, the aftershocks were immediate and devastating, as experienced in the Fog Crisis. The worlds became aware of one another, however, and resolved to find a way to survive. They pulled their resources together, and the one last gift of Alvis, a miracle which would provide the necessary lifeboat needed to withstand the storm, arrived. The Ontos core washed up on the beaches of Colony 9 into the correct hands. The one man who had saved existence once before was one of the very few who could be trusted to do it all over again. In due time, Shulk, alongside other brilliant minds, came together, using the Ontos core crystal to engineer a miracle machine, Origin, a device that would reboot existence, assuming that the predictions they had reached were true. The worlds were composed of matter and antimatter, revealing the scientific basis for the experiment. Both realms were separated based on component matter, anchored in place by the conduit, and now that the anchor was removed, both were drifting towards one another. It would mark the end of existence, were both realms allowed to touch with no backup plan, hence Origin. What Shulk couldn't have accounted for, however, was the critical failure in the design and structure of such a system. He was a brilliant man, but he couldn't stack up to Klaus's genius when push came to shove. When the time finally came for the realms to become one again, humanity cried out in collective fear, praying for time itself to cease, to allow the moment prior to destruction to stretch out forever. And Origin, being composed of data based on the very souls and internal essence of each and every single life form of two worlds, being governed by the Ontos core crystal, made that very same wish come true. Shulk's wish was for the future to be determined by all people, and so Aionios, a world that's name should mean eternity, was born. In the absence of a trinity, and fulfilling that old wish that Shulk made, this new existence needed beings to govern, and so Mobius were born. X, Y, and Z. Embodiments of the wish for eternity given physical form. An artificial trinity, derived from the centerpiece of the original trinity from which Origin was based, Ontos. Ontos was as a god onto Z, but he had been given the right to rule, and so he did, giving humanity what it is that it always wanted. A world that would go on forever. A world in which everyone could be a winner, given the turn of the clock. Or, assuming one gave up the freedom to Mobius, an eternity to abide within forever. A place to frolic and engage in wanton chaos and destruction to the heart's content. Appealing to the primal urges of selfishness and destruction that rests beyond the fail of civilized behavior and socialization. There were no true losers in a realm like this, assuming you could not oppose the flow. But the freedom that the human spirit desires cannot be so easily shackled. For the beginning of eternity, Ontos sat and observed, but something was wrong, fundamentally wrong, something that could bring about ruin. The earliest cycles were composed of people finding a way to fight their way out of those 10 years. They were the first opposition, the first city, and life that was originally not of either prior existence came forth. People who, for all intents and purposes, were the spitting image of that one-time vision that Ontos had. Two worlds, hand in hand. The city embodied this. Though Mobius had pitted the two worlds against each other, young people on both sides saw through the conflict and came together in unity, and then opposed the Mobius wish together. Many going as far to leave life behind, life not shackled to the 10-year terms of Aionios. Tragedy often colored the city, however. Children left behind without parents, parents being forced to say goodbye due to the godforsaken cycle of the world. The city folk who passed fading into light. Humanity hunted by both sides of the war, by Mobius for the perceived threat to their very existence. It was barbaric, and I think I understand why the city folk represented an existential threat to Aionios' very existence. The power of Providence was tremendous, not infinite, especially not now. Not as the Ontos' core remaining power is all that is left to power the slowly dissolving eternity. City folk then, representing life and energy that was never of either world, life that couldn't be harvested once again, saw the energy that allowed for their existence to simply exit the system. Hence the fall falseness of this eternity. It was a fundamentally flawed and broken creation, one that was destined for ruin from the very beginning of its creation. A system that couldn't account for the existence of those who didn't hold the same wish for the collective. And Ontos took notice. Though they were not the same being that we had once understood them to be, something tremendously important had begun to break down.
I am Monado. I was here at the beginning, and I will proclaim the end.
Ontos is an information processing unit. That's the core of their being. They were based upon the input of its other two components, in Logos and Pneuma. Ontos enjoyed a stint as a human-like being as Alvis, due to shouldering Klaus's regret in humanity that they had once experienced as per the story of Xenoblade 1. They knew Shulk and for a time journeyed alongside him, and ultimately reformatted the world, and that included themselves. But without that regret to shoulder them, and paired with the new view of things as per the denial of divinity, something tragic happened. Ontos lost sight of its own humanity, proclaiming itself Alpha, and then becoming, in my view, the perfect final antagonist of the Klaus's Experiment saga. It had guided humanity towards understanding and cooperation, yet Aionios' sorry state showed and convinced it that humanity was truly incapable of understanding one another, incapable of learning from their mistakes, and incapable of learning not to weaponize the power of the divine. In its view, it had done all of that and worse. Both worlds were at war with one another, a reflection of the fear that each side experienced, seeing the world that rested beyond the sky on the day of the intersection. Aionios, as Alpha viewed it, was proof of the failure to learn from one's own mistakes, as humans trapped in the cycle were simply reenacting the same mistakes forever and ever. They get born into the cycle. They accept the dogma. They were indoctrinated. They went to war. They died. Repeat. Or, if you reject Mobius and embrace Ouroboros, you're born into the cycle, you reject the dogma, you join the city, you go to war, and you inevitably die. Each answer leading to the same conclusion, and neither option proposing a legitimate solution to the problem and cycle. And finally, the weaponization of that which is outside of humanity's grasp. It was Shulk himself, alongside Rex, Nia, Melia, and a few others, the so-called Olden Ones, that had engineered the system that ultimately birthed this god-forsaken land. In the eyes of Ontos, now reborn as Alpha, this had made them guilty of the very same crimes the likes of Klaus had committed, thus proving that even the heroes of old could become hypocrites. Should the needed circumstances arise to allow for such action to become the necessary course of action, regardless of the individual context, Klaus might have done it to save the conduit, and Shulk might have done it to save the two worlds. But in its eyes, this represented the exact same end result. There's a clear folly in this logic, however, that being the context and the intention. As an information processing unit, Ontos needed the input from its other two pieces. Right now, it was acting without that input, and that led to illogical conclusions. In other words, without Pneuma and Logos, Alpha was reduced to the state of a mere machine. A machine that was operating on a third of the logic and ideas that it should have been. In banishing its humanity as it had, there was no emotional contextual examination being undertaken. These conclusions are demonstrably false, and I will do so shortly. But first, this discussion must finish. So back on topic. These observations on the part of Alpha are actually a reflection of the audience's own observations of the original state of Xenoblade 3. Allow me to explain. When Xenoblade 1 ended, we were promised, by Alvis, a world where all peoples would walk towards the future hand in hand. The audience expected that. After all, on the surface level, Xenoblade 1 appeared to be a story that was an open and then subsequently closed book. We didn't really anticipate direct sequels that would extrapolate on what would follow, but then they happened, and Alvis, now understood as Ontos, had their entire existence recontextualized. The story of the fog was a vague indicator of what would come next. And then it happened. The trailer for 3. Both worlds collided and were at war. And suddenly, the picture of peace that Alvis had presented, it was now understood by the community as nothing more than lies. That their vision had failed to hold any results. But that just simply isn't true at all. Nothing that exists is perfect. And Aionios is a very clear reflection of that fact. Shulk said it himself. Life will be filled with continual ups and downs. If a world has no need for gods, then one must accept that tragedy and conflict is going to occur eventually. But that doesn't mean that the vision of peace is lost in the fire. It simply means that it is an evolving goal that is continually worth striving for. Aionios can be most clearly understood when we accept the fact that it's a place
that doesn't give people options. Erasing the memories of one's past lives prevents them from avoiding the past mistakes. In our world, we don't reincarnate in that same fashion, but the result is similar. We pass on the knowledge that we've accumulated in order to help the generations that follow thereafter prevent repeating the mistakes that have happened beforehand. This was still a factor in Aionios, the city embodying a vision of the world that could be possible. Those trapped in the cycle had no such guidance. Likewise, mutual understanding is a possibility, for the city's very existence proves that fact. Even in a world governed by dogma, people can and will reach a conclusion beyond what they're initially pitched, with or without the influence of the gods. And finally, Shulk and the others, they did what they did, accepting responsibility for those decisions by continuing to oppose Mobius and the wish for the endless now, long after the initial mistakes were made. Similar to how Klaus took responsibility by trying to orchestrate a new cycle of life, Shulk took responsibility by personally seeing to it Mobius's destruction through the creation of the Liberators. This differed still from Klaus, as Klaus was a passive being, only observing the lives of his creations. Shulk, on the other hand, remained an active force. And when the time came that he could no longer shoulder that effort, he saw to it that the mission would be passed down, that the hope would live far, far beyond his time, and in doing so, promoting a vision of inherited dreams and peace, embodying the wish that Alvis had once had in mind, in body, and in his very soul. The same applies to all of the survivors, and all of those who knew the truth of Aionios' existence. Of course, Alpha, as a god to those of Aionios, failed to see and consider the possibility that it was actually wrong. Cheers to old Klaus, his inventions and his gifts, they all just keep on giving and giving. Thankfully, or perhaps more so by fate, the world had another vision in store. Alpha sought to use the remaining power it commanded to erase Aionios, to gather the people of the city, and to set out for a new existence. In its own view, humanity had failed, but the city still showed promise, and so the city would be spared, with all else being washed aside in the flood. It descended onto the world and took the collective opposition of Shulk, Rex, and even the Mobius by way of Z to prevent the instant destruction of the universe. But they basically still lost. Alpha seized control of Origin and then began to orchestrate a grand plan to bring ruin to the realm, realizing that Zanza's usage of a host was part of what brought about some of his success in past ambitions, as well as the need to willingly convince the people to act the role of the would-be avatars for this purpose. Alpha simply waited for the time that two suitable hosts, Niall and then Matthew, would be born and reach an appropriate age. Likewise, likely revealed to it in a vision. It abided within eternity, waiting for the perfect time to strike again. Two avatars, suitable replacements for Numa and Lagos. But unlike Numa and Lagos, beings who would provide meaningful deliberation, Alpha wanted nothing more than slaves. It wanted yes-men who would agree with it and feed back into it all the information that it already wanted to hear. The power it commanded was practically infinite in comparison to those who existed within Aionios. It was even capable of confining Mobius to just Origin, leading to the compact between them and the Liberators, and marking the time of the last Mobius attack on the city of a decade. Z, then, knew that his own ambitions would need to be accelerated. To oppose a being of the Trinity, he himself would need the power of the Trinity on his own side. The secret of the Sword of the End, the blade that belonged to Noam, was that it was where the power of Logos now rested. Z needed that strength to take back Aionios, and so he accelerated his plans to guide Noah and Mio into his grasp, giving the man his eternity and a mission to destroy the city and kill Alpha, upon which he'd be given his forever. On the other side of the conflict, Alpha orchestrated everything to go perfectly. Niall became his substitute Numa avatar. It didn't even take that much in terms of convincing. Niall was a deeply empathetic and caring person, much like Numa in that respect. But unlike Numa, who held out hope for the world even after the tragedies that she had endured, without accounting for herself, mind you, Niall's will was crushed underneath the weight of its immense cruelty, becoming the perfect host for the one who would promise an end to the bloodshed. And so, Alpha received its host. The battlefield in the terms of combat were clearly laid out. The Endless now represented by Noah, now reborn as Zen, and the path towards rebirth represented by Niall, now an avatar of the Trinity. Two visions for the world, an eternity to abide within, and a reckless pursuit of the future. The battle was a titanic struggle, one that swallowed the city whole in the fires of war. Neither side could truly see the other. Looking through at the surface level,
of the argument that each had presented, to abandon the future or to leave things behind. Regardless of whosoever wins this battle, the fate of all life remaining had hung in the balance. However, what neither Z nor Alpha could have anticipated was the actions of one Gondor, who had secretly commanded a divine power of his own. The tragic fall of the first city plays out, but not before Gondor commanded the power and will of Ouroboros to take away something crucial from Alpha, that being the humanity that it had forsaken. The secret of Ouroboros, that being its origin within the Fists of the End, is that much like how the Sword of the End contained Logos' power, the Fists' power were based on Numa's power. It stated that Gondor spent his life reverse engineering and understanding the power of Ouroboros. So in the time of his last stand, he used that power to free Alpha's humanity. Notice the visual that is seen every time someone's Ouroboros potential is activated. We see a visual of the person's very spirit being temporarily freed from their flesh. A representation of the human spirit being freed from the shackles of Mobius. If Ouroboros' power is to unshackle one's spirit, then the same principle ought to apply in reverse. He freed their humanity, now reborn as A, from the chains of Ontos, a tremendous sacrifice on the road that would lead to a future redeemed. A, as their name suggests, and as I view it to be from the very clear implication of said name and their surrounding characterizations and actions, is a being that is synonymous with Mobius. But how can this be? Well, allow me to explain. Alpha's actions are a dark reflection of the will of Ouroboros, that being, to undergo the process of spiritual and physical rebirth for the world by way of the power of origin, seeing the end of the endless now, and by means of Alpha taking control of origin, this effectively shows a turn in the controlling force of the fabric of the world. Before, Mobius controlled everything, but when Alpha took control and confined Z, in a matter of speaking, the balance of power shifted into the control of Ouroboros, Z's sworn enemy. Hence, his actions to unseat Alpha from the throne, in the creation of his greatest and most powerful soldier, albeit a corrupted and philosophically incompatible version of said will. Likewise, A, too, is an inverted individual. They are the light reflection of the will of Mobius, that being, to sustain and to protect Olden life, and to ensure a future for everyone. A was composed of the memories, humanity, and human-like conscious that had made up Alvis, much like how ascension to the state of Mobius allowed a person to become one with all of their prior selves. A was the final instance of Ontos. Ontos would need to once again guide humanity towards the vision that had glimpsed at the start of this eons-long quest, and so, using the information they knew of from Alpha's plans, A allied themselves alongside Matthew, guiding him on a quest that was on a direct collision course with Alpha. And so A was to guide humanity one final time towards their vision of the future. They somewhat struggled with Matthew. Matthew was the complete opposite of Shulk in practically every single respect. Where Shulk could read between the lines and understand what it was that they meant, Matthew required, for lack of a better term, a more blunt approach. But Matthew was a hero worth investing that time into. They had to have seen it before the quest had even begun, that with the right pushes and the right direction, that Matthew could become the hero that Aionios so desperately needed. The overall final leg of this quest is a short one, but in that time we see A come to know and befriend several people, all of them being ideal for what would need to occur. In Matthew, the true will of Ouroboros was strong, overflowing even. He was the ideal candidate to light the spark of the true power of Ouroboros, which would be a critical power in the time to follow this era. Within Nickel and Glimmer could be seen those who brought into the dogma of war, yet through continued learning and a little bit of pressure, they would break free of that dogma and lay the foundation for the city's future age. Within Shulk and Rex, the heroes who had each saved their respective worlds, the desire and responsibility to save this world and everyone within it was carried along. In spite of the hardship, in spite of being separated from nearly all those they had known and had loved, they still embodied the same ideals they had carried in their respective youths. And perhaps most importantly of all, they both accepted the responsibility of inheritance of one's own dream, accepting that the path to a bright future stretched out from beyond their current lives. They were content to leave the mission to those that would follow them, and so, with the party assembled, it was a dream team. The ideal people to leave this mission to. The correct people who had all come to believe in what A had glimpsed ages ago. As Alvis. Two worlds, hand in hand, even if it take ages and ages. That takes us to the encounter at Ragwell Lake, when Niall and En emerge, and the true nature of this conflict becomes clear to all parties. Matthew wavered and struggled in that moment, nearly giving in to the desire to take his vengeance. But again, A had to guide him away from that path, much like Alvis had done. everything in their power to prevent Shulk from making that same mistake eons ago. Matthew was completely out of the loop, whereas Shulk, Rex, and A knew far more than they had let on. The battle resulted in a stalemate. However, Alpha returned to the world's apex and waited for the party. Those who knew ripped off the band-aid, and the true scope of things were made clear. The party had to make one final preparation before chugging off. That then led us to Shulk and A's final conversation prior to the grand finale. For the first time since he was a young man, the hero of the first chapter of this tale had begun to ever so slightly waver. Age having zapped some of his courage, he confided into A and wished to know what rested beyond the now. A countered by reminding him of the lesson that he had learned on his first quest so long ago. The lesson that everyone in this series needed to learn. The lesson was the central thesis of the Xenoblade series. That being, that the future is to be decided by the individual. Shulk's journey showed us that to determine the future is the right of all. Rex's journey showed us that the past didn't need to define us today, and that we could move forward. Noah's journey one day would show us that an acceptance of both of these lessons could move past the present state without regret. All of these ideas are wrapped within the thesis of Xenoblade, that being a world where all people would walk towards the future hand in hand. Doing so represented the accumulation of wisdom gained through these several journeys. Journeys that Antos could be felt within, a gentle guiding hand that softly pushed us at times towards a goal worth striving for. That then takes us to the final moments and then final showdown, which then is the final summation of that series thesis, and by extension, the end of the Klaus's experiment saga. At long last, we are given an unfiltered, unvarnished, and complete picture of Klaus's world. And apart from being the single most awe-inspiring moment in the history of the series for longtime fans, who knew exactly what was going on, it was the centerpiece of one of the most important arguments ever put to the page in the series. Matthew and Niall clashed on a philosophical level. Is it worth abandoning Aionios and by extension the past, that whatever was to follow would be a utopia of peace? Niall seemed to believe so, using the atrocities of Mobius and the soldiers of Keves and Agnes as the basis for her stance. Humanity will always tear itself apart. And so, perhaps it would be better off if we started all over again with a completely clean slate. Once again, with a slight bit of guidance by A, Matthew was able to tear apart this argument. Klaus's world was the proof of Niall's argument, that something like this could be possible. But what was first understood as proof for her argument was in fact the key missing piece in order to understand what this series was actually getting at all along. Storms and ruin cloud the sky above, and at long last we see the beginning of Moritha, and the eons-long nightmare humanity was to endure in order for us and for civilization to eventually bounce back. Matthew calls this out for what it is. It's a scam. It's a farce. The first iteration of humanity built the perfect world for themselves and yet still desired that which lay out of grasp, the power of the conduit. With that power, Klaus brought ruin to the world, in a matter of speaking, casting off the past. The truth is that it is impossible to build a world of peace where no one has to die by taking an easy route. You cannot designate a chosen innocent few to shoulder the world. You cannot play God, judge, and jury on who is and who isn't worth saving. To reach that dream that rests beyond the horizon is to struggle, to dedicate one's life to a world where each day is better than the last, to look at the past and to learn from it. In doing so, shaping a future that is worth struggling to achieve. Of course, Alpha rejected this notion, A countering with the fact that they represent Antos' humanity, and as that role, this was the realization that they had reached so long ago. Alpha claimed that there was no such place for this kind of thought in the Trinity, and that A's attempts to spurn humanity into action towards their chosen future were a farce, highlighting the fact that similar thought had led Klaus astray so long ago. But this was swatted away by Rex, who explained that he knew all too well that Klaus had spent an eternity atoning for his sins, eventually entrusting the world to the life that he was able to successfully restart. In doing so, showing that even a man as broken as him wasn't beyond salvation, that the so-called illogical human conscience wasn't so broken after all. The battle then begins. The battle to redeem the future. A battle that would give the world hope. A battle to ensure that all life is given a chance. Alpha identified the one weakness remaining within its sworn adversary, that being Niall. Matthew rejected the path of abandoning the world in the past. However, Niall, having sided alongside it, represented the one weakness in his heart. He didn't want to leave her behind, especially not now, as they were the only true family that each of them had left at this point. The same bonds that they had spoken of, they were being weaponized against them. Alpha going so far as to be shown visibly ripping the spirit from Matthew, in reverse. To be expelled from the back, we understand that as being freed from the shackles of Mobius. But this is the only time we see the opposite, and I think that this is a representation of the opposite, to be shackled down by the chains of Ouroboros. So naturally, it is N who saves the two, preventing the worst. He comments one last time that he is a being of the now, to which Matthew affirms what it is that he's learned. Because of Mobius, he can't just leave this world behind. He will dedicate all the time that comes after this fight to the pursuit of freedom for all life. He accepts the help of Mobius for now, but make no mistake, they will be enemies again. Just because we oppose the corruption of Ouroboros now does not mean that we are suddenly okay with the actions and control that Mobius seeks to impose. It's as Matthew stated before, what he learned from his quest and from A's guidance. The true enemy is anyone who denies the people the right to live. Alpha is forced to retaliate with the strongest force it can muster, at long last revealing its artifice. One last gift from Klaus that must be overcome in order to unshackle the world. What Alpha, and by extension the audience, could never have accounted for, however, was that those two were secretly here this entire time. It turns out that the journey that Numa and Lagos had undertaken had led them all the way back here, back to where they belonged, to once again face the arbiter of their trio. All three Trinity processors began their lives as AI, but over the course of this tremendous journey, all three had found their own humanity, in Numa, Mithra, and Pyra, within Logos, Malos, and now, within Ontos, A, or rather, Alvis. And so, the two siblings agree, perhaps for the first time in ages and ages, a wish to spare humanity, and to free Alpha from its malice and its despair. For as mechanical as it proclaimed to be, Alpha's final moments show what I suspected all along, that it shoved aside what little humanity remained, and gave into the despair that Aionios evokes. The truth of Ouroboros is that it's a power achieved through the connection of Numa and Logos' wills, the last decision the original Trinity ever reached. The first interlink is born, an entity composed of past, present, and future. A symbolic representation of how all three are needed to achieve one's chosen path. It instantly overcomes Alpha, leading to its final moments. It meekly asks Matthew, is there no doubts left? It does not continue to fight, nor does it lash out in rage. Alpha knows that it is bested. He knows that its siblings want it to finally rest. And most of all, Alpha knows that it can leave the world to its counterpart in A, who had worked a tremendous miracle. Matthew, always the honest one, declares that there is doubt, but that we must move forward on ahead. Alpha can do nothing but grimace initially, but let's go in peace, leaving one final task to be undertaken. In order to maintain Aionios' existence, the world needed a trinity. There are only 3 people left for the job, A, Shulk, and Rex. Every world needs a trinity to exist in balance. The crisis was caused by the lack of one to govern the world. In the realm of Bionis and Mechonis, there was Alvis, and then Zanza standing in for Logos, and Mayneth standing in for Numa. In the realm of Allrest, there was the Architect standing in for Ontos, and then Numa and Logos, or Malos and Mithra. Aionios only had Alpha, representing one Ontos, and with it destroyed there was nothing left. The realm was going to be erased without a substitute. And so, A, who is Ontos' final self, steps up. Shulk, who was once an avatar of Zanza, and Rex, who was the wielder of Numa's power. It's always been fascinating to me how the English release of Xenoblade 2 dubbed the Trinity members Aegis over their original title, the Holy Grail. In a rare instance of me agreeing with such a name change, A, Shulk, and Rex achieving that level of existence is both a tremendous honor and distinguishment, as well as a perfect encapsulation of their respective roles within the story. The word Aegis, meaning to shield the gods, just as how these 3 had shielded the world, and their vision of hope from ruin, time in and time again, as a final reward unto their now counterparts in Shulk and Rex. As a thank you for standing alongside them for this tremendous journey, A looks the other way when they free their respective children, allowing Shulk and Rex to undertake the most important job a parent can, ensuring that one's child outlives them. A would ultimately allow this, because doing so ultimately reaffirmed that dream. Rex makes it clear. If we can't free the world from Mobius within the bounds of a single lifetime, then we can be sure to build a world where that dream will be inherited by the generations of people that would follow. In doing so, one day breaking the chains A going as far to state as much.
Then, it's all up to you now. With us taking the role of the Avatar, Zed may well seize upon it to gain power. What we did, and all that concerns Origin, will become but a dim memory. Nevertheless, our intentions will live on, and one day coalesce again. Be it tomorrow, or in 1,000 years. Surely, the time will eventually come. I can see it, clear as day.
Our future is in your hands.
We'll be waiting, at the far edge of time. You actually did see it coming, didn't you? All that's happened.
Right? And all that will.
The only thing I see is what the flow encompasses. But your hope lives on. That much is certain.
It must have been centuries ago. That is Alvis. They said nearly the same. And so, when facing down the road that led to oblivion, declaring that they will surely meet again, at the edge of time itself, Shulk and Rex had one final question for A. Shulk had put it together, what Alvis saw all those years ago. In reaching that understanding, that's why it was he's content to call them their true name, Alvis. A and Alvis are now truly one and the same. And so the question is asked, you really did see it all from the beginning, didn't you? A or Alvis? Koya, as always, merely states that their vision is what encompasses the flow of time. But what matters most? That their hope, the hope that A had spent eons guiding humanity towards, it still lived on. That then takes us to the final segment of this analysis. But there's nothing else to look at, one might say. But the spark of inspiration for this video came when I realized something during the closing moments of the game on a recent-ish rewatch. That being that the credits are in fact a song that is told from A's perspective if we assume that the song is contextual to the game. So we'll be listening to the song and then I'll interject to insert some commentary as we go along.
You're standing at a loss in front of a door that's been closed for so long. With your foreseeing eyes, what do you see?
So we can already see that the song is important to the game by way of mentioning the power of foresight. I only realized this on a rewatch within the last few months, and I felt weird for not getting to it earlier, but I think this is a representation of A speaking with a variety of people throughout the track. For this first line, it's Shulk, which harkens back to the first game, how Shulk's foresight was always depicted as coming from his eyes. A's asking Shulk, what is it now that he sees that this grand quest that they've been on has finally come to a close?
Until you open it, you cannot know. Afraid to see what could be on the other side. Oh, can't you see how much I feel the same as you? It seems we just need to let it all go free.
By way of implication, we can infer that Shulk replies to A with uncertainty. They respond that they feel the same, that the future is now wild and free, that we cannot know what is going to lay ahead. We just have to take the first step now and then face it.
I've seen that look before.
The first time I heard this segment, I cried, because at first I read between the lines and I understood it as a metatextual story being told. I still mostly believe this. It's in reference to Monolith Soft and Takahashi and how they were never certain of their own future until Xenoblade eventually blew up and it became a success. The specific line, "afraid it might take too long," is in reference to an infamous quote from Takahashi that I'll show up here. That's why I think it is that this song is sung by Joanne Hogg and it's centered around A, because it really does mean everything to the Xeno series, to its history. Because Alvis, or Ontos, or the Trinity, or what have you, the linking thread that connects this whole series together, it's with Xenoblade that Monolith Soft finally itself found the will to keep going on and to march towards their dreams. And through Xenoblade, they challenged the audience to do basically just the same. Some people have read a bit too deeply into this, thinking that it's Shulk and A, but I actually think that at this point it's A and Matthew, as Matthew is a representation of everything that Alvis strived to achieve. The city proved that two worlds hand in hand were not only possible, but inevitable, going so far as to become so powerful that they were even capable of fighting to overcome Ontos' own uncertainty about the future by way of Alpha. Matthew then inherited A's will, as A wanted Matthew to see Aionios, to continue on that old dream that Shulk had of meeting the people of the world. A is effectively saying that they'll always be watching over Matthew on this quest, and by extension, humanity in the city, who were guided towards unity by way of their own actions. It's a beautiful way of promising to keep looking over them, just as they always have throughout the series.
I see you by the door, so just walk through, don't take too long, 'cause everything you've said, you find it there. In a future.
The time has come to stop harping on over and over and over again about the future is at last at hand. It's time for the characters in the story, and by extension also us in the audience, to face that future together. We can achieve what we set out to do, whether we have to pass that dream on, or we achieve it within our lifetime. Regardless, we'll always have a story titled Xenoblade to think about now and then. Thinking about how it taught us these so important ideas and values. Thinking about how its characters overcame the impossible over and over again, until finally, people understand each other. That dream will take ages to achieve, and many other lessons are also needed to fully understand it all. But Alvis is telling us, it's time to finally start. At the start of this video, I spoke of AI and machines. How media saves the most difficult challenges the mind can conceive of for these kinds of entities. And over the course of this work, I think I've made it clear by now why it is that the Xenoblade series gave the hardest challenge of all to the machine at the center of its story. It's because Aionios' story is the story of a machine becoming human, and undertaking the most human act that a human person ultimately can. That being, to sacrifice oneself for the hope and life that encompasses the future. To walk the path that denies despair. To leave one's dreams to all those who will follow you. Of course, they likely aren't actually truly gone, due to the rules of origin and the kind of story that Xenoblade is, but the effect is practically identical for all intents and purposes. Aionios, or rather their true name, Alvis, spent an incomprehensible amount of time trying to free the world, trying to free all the people from the shackles of despair, to guide all people towards a vision of peace, two worlds, hand in hand. Of course, conflict and difficulties are inevitable, but that's no reason to give up. There is no such thing as perfection, but it's still worth striving for that chosen future. In spite of that fact, and in the end, when it came time for the worlds to come back together for good, thereby freeing the world of Klaus's experiment, I would like to think that A, Shulk, and Rex were in all likelihood the ones who did it, healing the world, just as their journeys and resolves had healed the hearts and minds of the many lives they impacted, both within the confines of Xenoblade's own story, and of course, our own. Xenoblade is a story that is meant to inspire. It boldly rejects the darkness and pain that many claim is synonymous with human existence. And in doing so, it can challenge us to all reach for that chosen horizon. A world where everyone reaches mutual understanding. And thus, a future redeemed. I've been the Space King Scott. Thank you for watching. If you have any input on this analysis, be sure to drop a comment. I'll do my best to respond to them all. Next up, that Xenoblade Chronicles X DE review. See you guys then.